Rosa Parks was a highly trained political operative. Like, this was a planned, organized mission. And like all of those moments in history where people have been just like kind of washed away to the symbol that they are, instead of the deep exploration. I want to teach young Girl Scouts that Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer operated like Princess Leia. Like, I want them to understand that these femmes were generals.
Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to the Unbroken Chain podcast. I'm Maura James, and I'm so excited to be with you once again here today. Thank you for showing up. I feel your hearts out there, and I'm with you in the flames, fighting and loving. I saw a wonderful sign the other day that said, "Your heart is a muscle the size of your fist. Keep loving, keep fighting." It's one and the same. It is a practice of devotion, and I know you all are showing up and learning how to deepen that practice, and I'm really grateful. We need you. This week, I am so excited to share this conversation. This is Jasmyn Elise Story, who recently moved back to Birmingham, where they grew up. And Jasmyn is an international restorative justice facilitator and have been a dedicated human rights activist for a decade now. They have a master's in human rights, and currently they're focusing on community mobilization and the integration of restorative justice practices in the city of Birmingham, which has, of course, been historically a place where some of America's deepest struggle for justice has been initiated and sustained. For those of you this week, this year, this lifetime, who have been working with abolition, with ideas of defunding the police, and are really excited about a lot of the change and transformation that's happening right now, but aren't necessarily sure what comes next. Restorative justice, transformative justice is an incredible toolkit to start manifesting new structures to replace policing, which of course started from slave catching. I think a lot of these ideas seem very radical when we first encounter them. I think it's really important to talk through what it actually means to replace structural harm, to replace punitive justice, to replace authoritarian control, and not just talk about what we don't want, but to envision what can be in its place. And Jasmyn has that vision. Oh my goodness. And they're a wonderful communicator to help paint that so that we can all get on the same page and get really clear, really organized about what we're fighting for. I really just want to jump right into it because I learned so much in this process. I think that's been the name of the game for so many of us. There is room for all of us in the future that we're creating right now. And I just want to remind you that your gifts have a place here. Not everyone plays the exact same role in revolution or community building, but the invitation awaits you for that which brings you joy, that which nourishes you, the gifts that you have in this particular human incarnation. You become a conduit for justice, for healing, for connection by applying those to your community. And that's an imperative for all of us right now. Okay, this is Jasmyn Elise Story coming to you from Birmingham, Alabama. Join us.
For those closest to me, I prefer Jazz. I utilize they, them pronouns, and I am a restorative justice facilitator. I am a transformative justice facilitator. I am an individual that is deeply, deeply dedicated to addressing historical harm in this country, but also current structural harm in this country, and facilitating processes that not only allow individuals to have interpersonal healing, but encourage us to challenge structures so that we can have generational healing moving forward. So that's me.
And what could be more important to work on in this world right now? I mean, thank you. Yeah.
I think the crises of the last couple of months, or maybe depending on where you start your timeline, 2017, have illuminated the structural violences, historical violences, and those who are impacted. I think we're seeing the impact of those things more, be it because of social media or just storytelling. And I'm happy that more people are now invested in trying to figure out how they can heal it.
I feel like a bunch of abolitionists were just made in the last week, which is so exciting.
If you didn't know that you want people to be free of cages before, I think that is becomes polarizing for most people. This moment has become polarizing for most people, drawing them into more of an active support space for any action, direct action, or policy reform that will eliminate what we're seeing, this brutality that we're seeing across the country.
So can you give us a little bit of a primer for people that are working with the terms like restorative justice and transformative justice, how you see that?
So for me, restorative and transformative justice are processes that put harm in the center of the dialogue. So instead of focusing on one individual, one personality, one organization, one company, these processes allow for storytelling to help us understand the landscape of the harm so that we can then identify the needs that harm has produced, and not only brainstorm solutions as a community to address the interpersonal solutions for meeting those needs, but to also name and look at what are the structural changes that need to happen to address the needs that are either lingering after an incident or were the thing that caused that incident to occur. That could be coming from either the harmed party or the party that caused the harm. Those needs are so interconnected because we are all so interconnected. So these processes kind of take a bird's eye view of the situation and allow storytelling to drive the process towards solution.
Do you remember when you became aware in your life that there were structural harms, that your world was made out of that in this culture?
I think I was very lucky to have two parents that did not hide or shy away from that storytelling. And I also come from a family that's connected to a huge civil rights movement and moment. And that kept me drastically aware of historical harm, structural harm, specifically racism and racial violence. My grandfather was the uncle of Denise McNamara, who was killed in the 16th Street church bombing. So my uncle, Chris McNamara, my cousins, Lisa and Kim, and my auntie Maxine have always been in my world. And so the lingering harm of that moment on my family has also always been a part of my world. I think I was in 4th grade when I won this poetry contest where I wrote this little poem about the bombing. So even at a very young age, I was acutely aware of this type of harm. And my parents made sure that we also were educated around the causation. So my mom, though she's not an academic herself, and I can't say that when she took us to these museums, she was deeply invested in being the teacher in that space, but she made sure that she took us to spaces where we could engage with educators who could teach us about these moments. So there wasn't a vacation where a museum wasn't visited to. That was a really important part of her mothering.
What is that like to grow up with stories where people that look like you are being harmed? Like, how does that shape your sense of the world and your place in it?
I think it prepared me. I think I've always had fire in my belly. I don't think that I had to come to an awakening. I think what I have spent the bulk of my life doing is trying to understand how to change it. But my early childhood was deeply seeped in the understanding that it's happening. So anything that I might have personally wanted to do in life, if I never allowed myself, and I don't think that my parents really allowed us to pretend that the American dream was something that was to be achieved without constantly caring for community. So I remember the first time I decided to give up something that I was truly talented in was Trayvon Martin. I decided that I wanted to be an actress for a while. I was like, yeah, I don't want to be on the stage anymore. Like, Trayvon Martin's murder changed my trajectory. And that's when I was like, okay, I'm doing this now. Mike Brown is when I first created my nonprofit, the People's Coalition. So I think that for the adult period of my life, I finally got to those crossroads that I think my parents prepared me for, where there might be a moment where my personal interest needed to be transformed, not sacrificed, but transformed to serve a movement.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I really feel that in your signal. It seems like the call to service is like a spiritual mandate. It's really beautiful.
I don't see any other purpose. Like, I for myself, and according to my aunt, I've always been this way. And so a lot of it I want to put on my parents, and especially my grandfather, who walked around, he would say that it was his job to take care of the widows and the children. That He quoted it all of the time. I think we had maybe 3 retirement parties for him at one point, just trying to get him out of the school system. But he was a children's librarian. And from that place was his pulpit. He was able to make generational change in the lives of, at different points in time, the most vulnerable children in Indiana were in Gary, Indiana, where he lived. And that was his mandate in life, and he wore that proudly. And I think that a lot of what I am, I attribute to him and my mother, because they are such communal servants. But according to my aunt, when I was like 2 or 3, the Feed the Children commercial came on. It was like a family gathering, and the commercial's on, so all the adults converse and go back to enjoying each other before whatever was on television returned. And when the commercial ended, I was so devastated by the commercial that I turned and started yelling at all the adults, according to my aunt. And we're all storytellers, so like I cannot vouch for the validity of this story. But I yelled at them. I was like, but what about the babies? What are you guys going to do with the babies? And she said that it was the funniest thing to watch a baby yell at adults about these babies that were on television. So I think part of me has always been this way, but it was fostered by these 2 incredible people that raised me, my grandfather and my mom.
I'm so grateful that wasn't conditioned out of you, because I feel like kids have that innate understanding, and then somehow as we're socialized, we're just told like, oh no, this is just the world that you live in, oppression is normal.
Right. What? These things are fine. And I have to thank the South for that. I think that the South also polarized that issue. Growing up here, it was like very clear to me things like when things weren't right, they weren't right. And I think that I've always had a little bit of a fearlessness about me that could be at different times truly reckless, where I was just like, oh, okay, like I'm going to throw my whole little body into this and see if that makes a difference. And luckily, I feel like people have caught me every time. But I know that a lot of people, that's not true. Like, they threw their whole body into something they believed in and were either shut down in a way that broke them emotionally and spiritually, or depending on that moment, were broke down physically. I had plenty of friends who tried to stand up for other kids in school and were then pulled into whatever physical violence that other child was engaged in. I think that those moments, if you're not protected, if you're not resilient, and you're a child, it's too easy to lose that energy and spirit about you.
That's a great point. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. Are you working with a particular lineage of wisdom in terms of the justice work that you're doing?
So I like to think about restorative justice like fashion and drag houses.
Ooh.
So, like, I think about it like the house of this, the house of that. And I was brought into restorative justice in the House of Carp, as I call it. So David Carp is a restorative justice facilitator, educator, professor who I met at Skidmore College when I was 18 years old. And they are now heading up the Restorative Justice Institute at the University of San Diego. And I was very lucky to be introduced to them and their friend, who isn't like an uncle to me, Duke Fisher, while I was battling with PTSD from a recent sexual assault before I met them. And in this mediation training where we first encountered each other, I just was blown away by the possibility of a different kind of justice. I was blown away by the idea that there were justice processes out there that centered someone who had been harmed and their needs, especially because I had gone through the traditional SVU process of like, go to the police. Like, I felt like being so young that I did everything right. And then to watch this thing not be what I needed it to be, very confused about then what are these systems for? And at the same time, I have a brother who is formerly incarcerated and was realizing and watching their struggles and really trying to reckon with myself as a victim of violence and the victim of a justice system that took away such an important person to me, and realize, like, in no way are anybody's needs being met here. That this doesn't pay back any debt to society my brother might have owed to the community, and in no way are my needs met. So I just fell in love with it. And I remember at the closing of the training, they had us all stand in line and, like, say, what is the one takeaway? And I looked up and I was like, I now understand that listening is a form of love. And after that training, they pulled me in. They're like, do you want to work for us? And I was like, anything to get me out of the school's cafeteria? Yes. I'm like, I am done wiping tables. Take me to your office. So I started working with them and really haven't stopped ever. It's been a decade of collaboration and love and nurturing. And though the justice processes might have changed, I started off, that was a mediation training, and moved into restorative justice, and I've moved into restorative/transformative justice. They have always still been a deeply part of my life. So there are other houses that have informed my work. I think the work of Adrienne Marie Brown, the work of Sujatha, the work of Nuri Nasat, the work of Sonia Shaw has deeply informed who I am as a human being and as a practitioner, but I was forged in the House of Carp.
Okay, so I want to go into that beautiful nugget that you discovered about listening. What does that mean to you?
I think that one thing that I hate to attribute it to my Southern growth, but I do think that it is that, like, children are not to be listened to. That is I think a cultural understanding that is well accepted, that children are to be seen, not heard. You're to stay out of, quote, grown folks' business. That was something that I heard my whole life, because it's like, why are they right there? Like, why are they at the table? Like, go to the kiddie table. And I'm just like, I want to listen. But it's like my contribution wasn't valuable in those spaces. I can't say that anyone ever really deeply engaged with what I thought. My mother always listened to me, but when it comes to, like, actually asking and probing and trying to encourage a young person to expound upon ideas that they have, to ask difficult questions, to allow children who I think can handle nuance better than adults to actually listen to how they hold nuance, that is not something that I experienced as a young person, really until I went to the Alabama School of Fine Arts in 7th grade, and my 7th grade English teacher, Elizabeth Ross Hill, changed my life, because it was the first time I had an adult talk to me like I was a human being, and a human being that had ideas not only worth listening to, but worth challenging. Not to shut them down, but to challenge them so that I can get better at communicating them, or I can go even deeper with it. And that engagement is so invaluable. So to go from that being my upbringing to then being, 18, 19 years old and realizing there's another way to also listen too. There's a listening that validates experience. There's a listening that is informed by this understanding that you have something that I need for all of us to move forward. So it's more than just an inquiry and exploration. It's this deep-rooted idea that if I don't hear you, I can't move forward. And I think that is what I learned in that mediation training. It's like, okay, we have all these parties that are in conflict. There's always someone in the room that holds the key to someone else's healing. But if I don't create a process, an experience, if I don't curate a physical and emotional space where that's clear that this is the belief we all hold, then we're going to miss something out. We're going to give someone a solution that feels lackadaisical. Like, we're going to give a solution that doesn't feel tailored to the harm. We're going to come up with something that we think we would want and might not actually be soothing, healing, or even acceptable to the person who's caused harm.
And I guess we're kind of seeing that amplified on a big scale because we have such like a paternalistic government that's just meting out decisions and authority without any kind of communication a lot of times, it seems like.
Yes, I think like you see that in government, and I think you see it also from our national politicians. I really chose to sit back and allow this Democratic primary to serve as case study for me when it comes to communal listening. And I think that there's a clear difference when you listen to a candidate who is listening to affirm a community versus listening to build a table with the community. So what that sounds like to me is when you see a candidate go to maybe a community organization that works with undocumented people, and they stand out front. They're physically in front, and their words are in front, where they are naming what they feel is important about that organization or the movement that organization is a part of. I feel like that's very different than when you watch a candidate put a member of that community in front and allow them to name what their principles are, or what their demands of government are, or what are their solutions that they see. And then that candidate follows that with, I'm dedicated to making that happen. Right? Like that's a completely different kind of listening. And I think that even watching people who might be well-intentioned, it's just so clear that we don't live in a culture of accountability. We don't live in a culture of relation, and we don't live in a culture of listening. And it doesn't matter even if there are fan favorites. That's something all of us were raised in. So we're going to see it in government. And so changing that on an interpersonal level is just as important as changing on a structural level, because they inform each other.
If you're not comfortable exploring this is totally fine, but I'd be curious, when you said you went through sort of like the stereotypical SVU process, I think as a lot of people are grappling with the idea of, like, let's say defunding the police right now, there's this idea of like, well, victims need somebody there to do the function. So I'd be curious what your experience was when you tried to go through those systems. Like, what happens when listening doesn't, like, who is served? Is anyone served? What?
Yeah, no, I would love to, because I think this is why, this part of my story is why I'm so dedicated to restorative and transformative processes. Because, again, sitting in this space of having both ends of the justice system, where I have been a victim who has gone through the process, and I've also been the family member of someone who has been incarcerated for almost a decade, I have felt the pain of both spaces. So with my process, I was assaulted by a stranger at a party. I have narcolepsy, and I had just quit a medication that I didn't like how it made me feel, and I kind of was just like coming off of it in a way that wasn't great. It was a really intense medication that like sedated my sleep to try to boost my energy during the day. And I quit it, and so I wasn't really myself, and I was having these narcoleptic episodes where I was just like going to sleep. I go to sleep very rapidly, and I was going to sleep at this party. I kept trying to find my like places to hide because I was brought there by some friends, and I remember telling my friend's cousin, like, just watch me, I'm going to sleep under the table. And the person who harmed me, assuming I was drunk, told my friend's cousin, I'm going to take her outside. She needs air. And everything that happened afterwards, it was immediately clear to me what was going on. Nobody could hear me, though, because of the music of the party. Luckily, I had some guy friends of mine that were like brothers. They came down to get me. Like, they came down to this party and got me. And the next day, I went to the police to start the formal process. So the first thing that we did was, like, I went to the ER. I went through that. And then eventually, after doing all of the detailed investigation piece, you move on to the meetings with the district attorney's office that's going to handle your case. So after meeting with them, within 8 days, I actually was starting school in London. So I went through this process fairly quickly, but I did everything that I was supposed to do as someone who had been harmed. The only resources that were offered to me, I'll never forget this sweet victim advocate, but obviously the system is at fault, not her, passed this neon sheet of paper to me that I'll never forget how aggressively colored it was. That was victim services that the state would pay for. And it was, limited, you could get, 4 therapy sessions or something, here or there. And I remember looking and just this is just so unsatisfactory. And so I moved to London. I moved to London with anger in my heart. I moved to London with confusion. I moved to London with also pride in my ability to do what I thought was my mandate. I did watch SVU as a young kid, and I remember being so angry at all of the victims that didn't go through with the process. And I'm just why? And I remember driving in my car home the next day and was I refuse to be one of these people, but I don't want to step to the plate, but I can't be one of the people that I'm angry at SVU. And then to go through the process and be no. You know what? Honestly, those people they understood what the system was, and they made a decision based on that. I didn't understand what the system was, and I made a decision based on my young understanding of what possibly would await for me specifically as a, quote, special victim, right? So I remember about a year after my case was opened and they were working on it, I called the DA's office and spoke to the individual who was handling my case, and they told me that they had dropped it. Because I was what's the update? I need to know if I need to be available to fly down to Georgia to testify or be in court, or I've worked to try to get myself healed up to handle this. What's going on? And they told me that they didn't want to put me through it because it would be a he said, she said, and that I was doing, quote, well in school, and they didn't want me to have to sit through the lawyer of the person who had harmed me doing their job, which would be to defame my character. She spoke very plainly, this is what their job is. Their job is to make sure that this person gets completely off because there's no in-between plea process for them. Even if they don't serve time, registering as a sex offender will be a part of it, and no lawyer and no parent is going to allow that to happen. So they're going to fight with all fire to make sure that this doesn't happen, and we don't want you to go through that. And I remember I was so hurt and angry, and I think the last thing I said to her on the phone was, I'm sorry, I was not a horse you were willing to bet on. And I hung up, and that was the end. And I had a panic attack. I just was so devastated that that decision could be made without my consent, that somebody decided what was best for me, even though that probably was the best decision. And looking back on it, once I started learning more about the justice system, restorative justice, the closer I was to my brother, what was going on with my brother while he was incarcerated, I realized it was wait a minute. I worked so hard. I spent a whole year prepping myself to have someone live what I lived through for one night, for the rest of their days as they serve in prison. And when it finally hit me, I remember I was a sophomore in college, that I could have possibly, without knowing, because I didn't understand what was going on in prisons, especially in the South, that I could have sentenced someone to be raped for their 2 to 5 years over my harm. I was like, that's not meeting my needs. That has nothing to do with me. That's the government, that's society getting its bones. That's them doing what they feel they need to do to break another human being for the betterment of society, and that has nothing to do with me. Because the only thing that had to do with me was when that woman passed that paper across the table. And that was the only thing in the whole process that had to do with me. So when I started to learn about restorative and transformative justice, it just made sense to me. I was like, oh, we're centering the story of the person who's harmed. We're listing the needs of the person who was harmed. We are also, if this is a transformative process in nature, we're trying to figure out what were the structural gaps that allowed the harmed party to enact this violence in the first place. And then we're making a plan to move forward. That's all I need. Everything else is a horse and pony show of crime and punishment, and it has nothing to do with healing. So I became deeply, deeply, deeply dedicated to not only facilitating these processes for other people who've experienced an array of harm, to also being an advocate for this, all the way to sitting in the West Wing with David Karp, Mary Koss, Karen Williamson, the DOJ, and the vice president at the time, Vice President Biden's Task Force for Violence Against Women, as the survivor voice in the room, speaking very, very clearly about why they need to expand services to survivors that incorporate or allow them to, if they want to, move into a restorative justice or transformative justice space. Because this is about needs. It's about healing needs. It's about a justice that is holistic. And I'm so happy that this has been my journey, because it's allowed me to speak deeply to it. I think I needed both experiences to make me realize everybody has failed here. Like, nobody wins here. I think a lot of times you see advocates who have one experience or the other, and I just sat there and was like, no, no one wins.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. It gives me goosebumps. Would you be able to, sort of continuing using this example of what happened to you, would you be able to speak to like how you would have liked that process to go, having the knowledge that you have now?
Absolutely. So if I imagine a restorative, transformative justice process for me in that moment, I like to think about who's in the room. So in the processes I facilitate, we organize people to the best of our ability, depending on what the harm is, by the level of impact that they experienced in the moment. And that kind of orders the storytelling. In the processes I facilitate, I have the person who caused harm speak first. It's important for me to do that. There's lots of debate in the community about who speaks first. And for me, in my processes, I have the person who's caused harm speak first, because it's important for me, for the people who've been harmed, to hear that person accept accountability from the jump and not have to share their story and sit and wonder, by the time it gets to that person, are they going to say something that's going to deepen my harm, further traumatize me, or harm me? I want to get that out of the way. And I want them to know the rest of the piece is you saying what you need, and not you trying to teach someone what they did wrong. I want you to hear from them that they have gone through the process with me to prep them to be able to be fully accountable. So you go most accountable to least accountable to least harm to most harm. And I like to end with the person who has been most harmed. So for me, if I'm working backwards, I, of course, would be the most harmed. And then I think the person sitting next to me would be my former partner at the time. So I was seeing someone when this happened, and they ended up having to be my nurse. I mean, I can't really explain, like, there is no other word sacred enough to describe what they had to be to me besides nurse for 3 years. From my mental health to the even physical manifestations of my trauma, they had to take care of me. So I'm like, when it comes to who needs to be responded to, whose needs need to be met, whose harm needs to be named, accounted for in the storytelling, the person next to me would 100% be my former partner, because they did the work. And we were kids. Like, now that I'm older, I'm just like, oh my God. That was on a 19-year-old to do. Unbelievable. Like, and they did it so well. Unbelievable. Then the next person would be my mom. Because though this person was my nurse because of proximity, my mom was their tag team partner, to the point that at one point I know I had a panic attack over like leaving a backpack at a friend's house, and I got into a catatonic like state. I was just laying in bed and like looking at the ceiling, but I could hear, and my partner and my mom are on the phone trying to decide if they need to call 911 to have me taken to the hospital. So it's like they had to do this. They had to constantly be a part of each other's lives for this pet project that was me being bruised and broken. And I think like I could fill it out from there. And when I get to like the least and accountable piece, my friends who brought me to that party, our relationships are ruined. They are both harm parties and people that I seek accountability from at the same time. So they would be, if I think about the circle, they would be in the middle of the circle. They'll be like right there on that borderline where the damage to our families and our friend relationships is unbelievable. These are people that I thought would be in my life for the rest of my life. Families that our families thought that we'd be in each other's lives for the rest of our lives. And this just threw a cannonball in our relationships. It just, because you have parents now having to take their kids to be interviewed by the police. You have, we're all like, some of them minors. I had just turned 18, so I didn't fall into the minor category, but some of them did. And that destruction, I believe, should be that person should be accountable for, but at the same time, they weren't who I needed them to be for me after this happened, because of course we were children, so the only thing that was on their mind was not getting in trouble for being at this party in the first place, for taking, to not telling the truth about where like everybody was, and that impacted how they showed up for me. And so then we move on, and I think that the people that I'd also include in this harm circle, this restorative justice moment, would be the women in that house who then told the DA's office that I was flirting with everyone. They just the defamation of who I was when I was a stranger to them. And one of the things that I remember them saying to quote, prove that I was drunk, which I was not at all. I was sleepy, which made me look like someone who could be taken advantage of, but at the same time wasn't true. It was earlier in the party because I was moving to London in 8 days. And I was very much a Anglophile when it came to the content I consumed. I was proving to people that I could speak in a British accent. And so, unfortunately for me, that alone was for everyone to be like, that human is just drunk. They're drunk versus one, being a child of the theater world, two, loving it at the time, everything British. I hadn't learned about the deep evil of colonization yet. Was just very happy to share with people my talent, which was not well received in rural Georgia. So, I would put them in it because their words impacted me not having the process that, now I arguably would not have wanted, but it did cause me harm to know that my case was dropped because of this kind of balanced he said, she said thing, especially since they were a community that was having this party and I was an outsider in it. And then the person who caused me harm would, of course, be the most responsible. And when I think about the needs that come out of all of this, I hear the need for me to have community, right? Community. There's a relational harm between me and so many of these individuals, my friends. There's relational damage to my romantic relationship because this person who I am trying to have just a young, light, fun romance with has now had to take on the full responsibility of an adult, and that is draining. There's the emotional harm there that I've experienced, which is a laundry list, and then there's the physical harm that I experienced, which was also a laundry list. And if this was facilitated by two experienced facilitators who are used to handling this type of harm, they would be listening as we shared our stories to capture what they hear from each person. And so I teach in restorative justice 4 harms. 3 are what I see standard, which is emotional, spiritual, relational, communal, material, physical. But the 4th one I use, which is to help me bridge the world of restorative justice and transformative justice, is inflamed structural and inflamed historical harm. And so a trained facilitator, if I was facilitating my own process, I would be listening for each person for all 4 of those. I want to know from, my former best friend, what those 4 harms look like for her. I want to be able to hear that, because the only way we're all going to move forward is if we address all of the needs that come out of all those individual harms. So it's a very special type of listening that you're doing, because it's very intentional. It's I have to understand your story so that I can hear the harm, so that I can then identify the needs. And that is it's a step-by-step part of the restorative justice process. So after that storytelling, after the facilitators gathered that, their role is to honor it and give it back. Wow. This is what I heard. Jazz, I heard from you that this was the emotional harm. Boom, boom, boom. List it out. I make it visible. I'm going to write it on a board, or I'm going to, write it somewhere so that the group can see what the true harm of this moment is. Because in a traditional punitive process, you're dealing with laws only. So in the court, it's you have sexually assaulted, and maybe if they're feeling frisky, they'll tag on false imprisonment, right? Just to get some weight on the charges. Those are 2 things that do not encapsulate the experience of a mom who has to take their child at 18 to the ER. This does not capture the experience of being 18 and taking Plan B for the first time without really choice or dialogue. It literally was just hand it to me in a cup. Go ahead and knock this one out. And that is important for the collective healing, for us to name it, see each other, and put it up there. And then when I think about the inflamed structural and historical harm that would be important to address, is what about this young man's upbringing that led to this moment? What about their understanding of the worth of another human being? Forget a gendered worth, but just a worth of another human being. Where did they miss this? Who didn't tell them the right information, or who actively gave them the wrong information? How do we shift whatever that structure is, so that a part of my healing is knowing that this was worth something? Somebody somewhere. If it's this young person saying, actually, my middle school refused to have sexual education, or actually my football coach actively promoted us to engage and act this way, or whatever it is, then charging them with changing that system as a part of what is needed to address the needs in the space. So for me, that would be my imaginary restorative justice process. And I don't have a need for that now. People ask me that often. They're like, would you want them? I'm no, because I had to do all that myself. It's been, next year, it'll be 10 years since this incident happened. And it's taken me longer to get to where I am now than I think I would have been if I would have been afforded a process like this. But I met all those needs myself. I figured out what they were. I named them. And it slowly took 10 years. Down to being so afraid as a non-binary femme to be femme. Like feeling like I drastically need to not look a certain way because of the fear and true self-hatred of the body that I felt like attracted violence. And that took so long. It would have been a lot easier for me to even hear from this person that it didn't matter who I was, right? Like that it wasn't because I loved to wear what I was wearing. It wasn't because I like chose to wear the contacts that I chose to wear that afternoon. That instead, this is a structural thing and I don't have to carry that. And maybe I wouldn't have had abusive emotional eating issues for a decade that I didn't have before. So for me, I've met those needs myself, but I do like to think of it because I think it's important for people's learning to know that if this process was offered to me, I would have been a very different person too. I would have been able to heal in a way. I would have been able to maybe even rebuild connections that are important for us as humans. We're pack animals. So losing two sisters that were my friends in this process, it would have been amazing if that didn't have to be the outcome.
And then they carry that out into the world with them, into all their future relationships.
We had a shared teacher who still keeps in contact with us. She was our 9th grade biology teacher. And I remember when I finally told her about what happened, because she was asking me, like, are you still friends with this person? Why not? Like, you guys were meant to be. It's like you were made for each other. And I really felt that. I mean, like, even how people talked about us, we were like Jack and Jill. Like, that's how you didn't hear one of our names without the other. And our shared 9th grade teacher, she really challenged me to forgive her because she was like, you guys are children. And I needed enough time to not be a child. I needed to grow up to realize how young 18 is. To be like, totally. To understand how like unintelligible like 18 is and just how confused 18 is to be able to let that go. But like, what if that could have happened in a process? What if somebody could have helped us see that? What if someone in the room would have offered that as healing and comment to this community that like, you guys are too young to have to carry this burden that the world put on your shoulders.
How do you hold that forgiveness piece? Because I hear a lot of people talking about that as if it's integral to your healing, that you won't be fixed or whole until you forgive, which I think puts a lot of onus on people that have experienced harm without any accountability. Like, I don't even know what forgiveness means sometimes in that situation. Like, how do you situate that?
I think that it's really important to separate, especially with restorative justice, the idea that out of this is a product of forgiveness. I think that I could easily have gone through this process and never forgiven this person and still had my needs met and still been able to heal and move on. Because a need for forgiveness, I believe, is tied to a bunch of different things. If I was a facilitator and I was working in a prep session with someone who'd been harmed by violence, and I have, and they look at me and they're like, we're going through their needs, and they say, I have a need to forgive this person. My job as a facilitator is not to necessarily just write that word down. I'll write it down because I'm going to always honor the words of anyone who I'm sitting with, but I'm going to ask them to help me understand it. What is your need for forgiveness? What does that look like? Is your need actually reintegration into your community? Do you feel like having to say out loud to people, I forgive this person, is the only way to get back into your community? Is your need for forgiveness tied to a need for safety? Are you worried about the anger that you're feeling in your body and how that might cause destruction in your world? So it's like, how do I help unpack forgiveness to make sure that it's not an umbrella word that's hiding a bunch of other needs? Because the only way this person actually is going to achieve that thing they're naming is if I help them break down the word forgiveness. For me, forgiveness was tied deeply to my need to not self-destruct. I was just like, I cannot wake up like this again tomorrow. Like, I have to figure out what I need to do to leave this behind. So forgiveness in no way had anything to do with that individual. It had nothing to do, and I'll use that term because it's the term that I think people can understand. It's like, oh, I forgive them. That's really what I'm saying is I went through enough processes to figure out how to stop the things that were continuing to linger somewhat enough to say, I've moved on. And so helping people understand what forgiveness actually means to them is really important to me. Because I think people force that on people as well. Like, oh, you have to forgive. Well, what does that mean? What are you really saying? Are you telling them that they can't be in community unless they forgive? Are you telling them that their anger is unacceptable to you? Are you saying that their sorrow is too much for you to handle? Are they no longer palatable to you? And that's why you're saying they need to forgive? How do I help someone challenge a call to forgiveness and really unpack what is that person actually telling you to do? Do they want to get over it because they're uncomfortable? Okay, so that means they need their own process because this is the reality of it and they can't put their needs on top of yours.
I love, too, that at the beginning of this, you were speaking to your realization that, like, if this person had ended up in jail for 5 years, gone through whatever trauma would have for sure happened in that period, that doesn't necessarily, well, it doesn't add to your healing or your sense of justice in any way. I listened to, have you heard the podcast White Lies? It's about Curtis Flowers, who's on death row, very clearly for absolutely no reason. Anyway, I was so blown away, and this is something that I've seen time and again with people that are on death row as like new evidence comes to show that they are innocent, is like the people who are like the family of the victims of the original crime are so hell-bent on that person being in prison because it represents some kind of justice when it's so clear that not only is that person innocent, but like so much trauma has been created by keeping that person incarcerated unfairly. It's just like whatever justice people are looking for who've been victimized, it's just completely perverted and does not serve any kind of healing in any way, just continues to perpetuate this enormous wound that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
And honestly, I believe that for most, especially people who are like hell-bent on a certain solution, doesn't matter what it is or what the harm is, like as small as a solution after like a larceny, or as big as a solution after murder or sexual violence. I listen to those solutions, and my favorite thing to ask is, what need will that meet? Ooh. It's not a judgment thing. I just want to know, what need will that meet for you? So if you need that person to be in prison, is that a need for them to suffer as you have suffered? And what does that look like? What is your suffering, and how can I help you? If you want that suffering to be communicated to them, then that's a very specific need. You want them to understand. You have a need for understanding. And you feel like this is the way for that person to understand your suffering, by them experiencing this thing that is incarceration. Or maybe your need is for something good to come out of this. The loss of your daughter is so alarming. It is so destructive to your world that you need to know something good is going to come out of it. And maybe you believe that incarceration keeps this person from harming someone else. So in your mind, that meets your need for something good to come out of it. So as a facilitator, it's really important for me to understand what that is. When I was at this alternative high school, there was a drama between a teacher and a student who they had given $5 for bus money. Now, this was a pretty, it was a community that experienced a good bit of violence, especially youth-on-youth violence. And this teacher had grown up in the same community and wanted to make sure that this young lady did not walk home. Gave her $5. Now, this young lady also sold food, snacks all over campus. So the teacher kept seeing this young lady make that money back, make that money back, make that money back, and never pay her. And she got angrier and angrier. She felt like she was purposely trying to, punk her in front of all of these other kids. And when I met with her to start a restorative process, it was very clear to me that this was not something she really wanted to engage in. Though, we were cool, her energy was not in a place where this process was something she really wanted. So I asked her, I was like, well, let's wait. Because I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere with her. I was like, give me a solution that would work for you. And she couldn't think of one. And so I asked her, I was like, if I got 500 pennies and had her lay them all out in the courtyard and tell everyone in the school what she did, would that meet your need? And the teacher was like, yes. And so then that gave me at least a turning point to actually break down what her needs really were. She needed this young person to understand how publicly shamed she felt by her behavior. So the solution of public shaming seemed great because that was a part of her need. She needed understanding around this. She also needed her reputation with other students to be restored. So the idea of this student doing something so public and ridiculous also was attractive to her because there was a need to communicate to the other students who she was as an educator. And I was able to like break all these things down, but only because of the solution allowed me to help see what the underlying needs are. And I think a lot of people think of solutions quickly, but aren't necessarily thinking about meeting all of the needs that any individual or community has.
You're really good at this. I can tell.
I love this work. I just love it. It makes sense to me.
Yeah. So when you're facilitating these kind of things, are you called in as an alternative to getting the traditional justice system involved?
Sometimes. I have operated full-time in schools doing this work, and in the alternative high school that was really important because if we had wonderful admin that were beyond allies, they were accomplices when it came to shifting the lives of the justice impacted, formerly incarcerated, and formerly trafficked students that we worked with. We also dealt with students who had truancy issues. In this space, they felt that if I could handle the process and we didn't have to necessarily call a PO officer, I always add officer, but that's redundant, a parole officer to report that we have to go through this traditional process. If we could handle it in-house, they were all about handling it in-house. Now, that doesn't mean that we broke rules that were immovable. So with certain levels of violence that happened on the campus, there was a mandatory suspension, but we shifted what that meant and what it felt like. So the vice principal would sit in the room with me, and the way we would frame it is that the community needs time to heal from you, and you need time to heal from the community. So this is not a suspension. This is not a punishment. We're giving you 2 days to plan how you're going to address these needs. We're giving you worksheets to fill out so that you're prepared when you come back to be reintegrated in a healthy way. And we'll be working with the community while you're going to make sure that they're ready to welcome you back because you're dedicated to showing up in this accountable way. So even with those things that were immovable, we changed what their purpose was. We reframed what this moment is. It's like, yes, you got so angry that you chose to punch through a screen and punch another student. You need a break from these kids. Like, you two need a break. But we want it to be a break that is productive, not a, quote, hication, as one of my students called it once. So I was like, that's hilarious. He's like, oh, you're going to suspend me? It's a hication. And I'm like, because, like you're going home by yourself. That has no value to your development as a character, as a human, or showing you what accountability looks like. So instead, you go through an RJ process, you go home with homework. You're getting a worksheet that helps you construct a restorative apology. You're getting a typed up list of all of the harms you agreed to handle. And you're coming back to brainstorm what that actually looks like.
It's so exciting. It's so like, yeah, just what does it look like to really take this on structurally? Because I feel like, we're talking about reforming the police and defunding and making some shifts, but it really feels like this is top down, totally different.
I think it's like top down and bottom up at the same time because the community has to realize that their needs aren't being met. Like someone needs to say out loud that like, yeah, that guy in the neighborhood who broke into your neighbor's house, who then spent 2 years in prison, is coming back more traumatized, can't get a job, can't get housing, your community is probably now more at risk.
Yes.
So, like, helping people understand that this doesn't serve them, I think, is step one. And then step two, when people talk about defunding or abolition, I think there often isn't the solutions served at the same time, right? So you're getting the appetizer, which is telling us what we want, but not necessarily the dinner, which is then who? If not the police, then who? And so for me, when I think about building structural alternatives within structures, I'm just shifting the roles of individuals. So yes, you can be a prosecutor, but I can train you to be a restorative justice facilitator.
Wow.
This can be your trade, and that's fine. But this process doesn't have to be what you make it look like. We can take a judge, and a judge is still a judge if they're sitting in a chair in a circle with people who have been harmed and people who've caused harm. Your role is the same in name, but your role in this circle is different. You're there to help facilitate holistic healing and meet needs. So it's, for me, it's not necessarily these people disappear and there's no one. It's we're shifting. I would like to see social workers riding in cars with police officers. I would like to see individuals who are dedicated and trained to do high-level de-escalation, which I truly did not see, witness, or understand until I worked at this alternative high school with these unbelievable adults who chose to educate there, where they could de-escalate a child with a knife without putting hands on them. Like, these are skills,
Yes.
and they are undervalued, and often they're siloed into places where it feels not translatable. But I would love, any special education teacher should be on the streets. Like, they know how to de-escalate people. Like, that's who I would like to see in our community, as well as making cultural shifts where this stuff lives not only in structural places, but also in informal places. If people are willing to give this to I had a friend who had the manager of their apartment building. They found out he was like stealing money from the apartment building. If there are moments like that where everybody was in disagreement about how to move forward with this man who, for so many of them, like, raised generations of their family because he had been the general manager of the apartment building, the doorman, the everything for them. How to move forward, if people culturally have access to these kind of processes in an informal space like that moment, those people might be more willing to vote to build processes that feel or are integrated into structures in a way that's healthy.
I can hear this, like, thread of cynicism that's sort of like, well, some people are just irrevocably evil people and they can't be accountable, and or they won't show up, or I'd be curious, from what you've seen, just from working with people that have perpetuated harm. First of all, I just think there's a stereotype of, like, the evil bad guy that's just way overblown in this world, period. But in these real world examples, like, how does this ripple out into the lives of people that do cause harm?
So in the process, before you get to the interpersonal part where people are actually sitting around each other, and sometimes you run restorative processes and people aren't sitting next to each other. I've done cases that fell under a kind of domestic violence lens, interpersonal, inter-partner violence, where we did letter writing. Same process, but it was a shuttling of paper. So before we get to those processes, whatever the final process is, there's prep work. That prep work is very important because you don't move forward into that second part of the process unless the person who's caused harm is fully accountable.
Got it.
So that's a crucial part that people often don't think about when they think about restorative justice. They think you just throw people in a room on day one and then, like, magic happens. It's like, no, you could take 6 months to build a process. I have colleagues who've taken actually a year and a half to build, because the harm was that viral really in the community, that it took that much time to prep the community for the process that would follow. So in that, you're looking for accountability from that individual. You're supporting them in showing up that way if they want to. And if you can see that they want to, but they, for some reason, keep circling back to, like, but it's not my fault, or then it's my job as a facilitator to figure out what need do they have that's keeping them from being accountable. And when I would do that with students, when I've done that with adults, it's often a fear of something or someone that is not in the room. So it's like, how do I break down whatever barrier is keeping you from being accountable so that you can show up for this person who's been harmed because they deserve that? So I take that on as a facilitator because often it might be something very, very small. Like the student is afraid they'll be suspended, or they're afraid that this process isn't going to be confidential, or they're afraid of legal retaliation. So it's like, okay, as a facilitator, how do I build the conditions in this microstructure to make this person feel like they can show up fully and be accountable? If they're not accountable, then this process isn't for them. But if we say that maybe, and this is completely just hypothetical, but if 10% of people who cause harm are unwilling to be accountable, for me, 10% is not enough to keep a system in place that then punishes 90% for the energy or the inability to be accountable of 10%. That doesn't make sense to me. It also means that 90% of those individuals' victims don't deserve healing because 10% of the victims are connected to an individual who cannot show up that way. And I fundamentally don't agree with that. But I think that people need to hear that. And I'm a part of a growing movement called In My Words right now, where we are centering survivors' voices to shift and name, like, do not use us as an excuse for punitive justice anymore.
Rad.
Stop using us as the example for why we can't think of something new, why we can't get creative, why we can't have new systems. Because often I do believe that it is sexual violence that people lean on to be like, no, incarceration is needed. It's like, you don't know what I need. So what this movement aims to do is to actually center the voices of survivors to amplify what we need in a way that makes it very clear that punitive justice doesn't meet any of these. So figure out, we're not going to be prescriptive about what it is, but figure it out. Find something.
Amen. Wow. Yeah, I think we're too quick to like protect existing systems that don't work by using the most extreme example. And yeah, no more of that. Okay, so I want to talk about the farm.
Yay!
Yeah, tell me about this new adventure.
So I have purchased a 15-acre farm. I have named it Freedom Farm Azul. Freedom Farm is to honor the work of Fannie Lou Hamer and the Freedom Farm Cooperative. And through her, really trying to honor the collective spirit, the collaboration, and the radical attempts of Southern Black femmes to shift systems exactly where they are, as they are. Not to be anything other than what and who they are and still demand change. And then the Azul is my homage to Frida and Casa Azul, because for me, my understanding of who Frida was, and as well as Diego Rivera, are two individuals that saw specifically in the communist movement. And I see this in a lot of indigenous spaces that I have had the honor of working within. When I used to live in South Africa, and in South Africa I saw this spirit as well, where communism might be attractive because in reality what they are attracted to is in the indigenous practice of communalism. So I think like communism is really, I think that the call for it is a return to communalism, not moving to this new radical form of society and capital good exchange, but instead this connection to people. And I feel, in my understanding of Frida, her work, her writing, the way she walked through life, is that the indigenous world, led by femmes, the communal nature of it, the communal spirit of it, is something that I deeply wanted to celebrate and honor, because it is the energy that I also want to bring to this space. And I want there to also be this cross-cultural, this global connection to this spirit of either the Freedom Farm Cooperative or Frida's work, trying to galvanize individuals in her space to my other hero, Steve Biko in South Africa, who also lost his life trying to help Hausa people return to this communalism. So that's what we intend to do on this farm, is to have this space be a space that serves people. So through education, through healing, through ritual, through ceremony, through exploration, as exciting as having a space for people to experience healing from experienced practitioners, to as what some people might not find as exciting as I do, to having a place for urban Girl Scouts to explore nature and earth and learn how to be stewards to this planet. So for me, I want this place to be a multifaceted environment with the same rooted goal of radical communalism.
So cool. I'm such a fan. Yes. Okay, so I admit I'm not familiar with the Freedom Farm Cooperative. What is that precedent?
So Fannie Lou Hamer operated a cooperative of Black farmers. And the way they served and showed up in community, there were points in time where people literally depended on them for food, where they fed those around them and shared resources to make that happen. Fannie Lou Hamer particularly is important to me because I believe that she's been purposely written out of history because she wasn't palatable to even the civil rights movement. There she is quoted talking about Coretta Scott King's disapproval of her and not wanting to be around her because of her class. She was very vocal about understanding that there were holes in this movement that were deeply tied to class and colorism. So her refusal, though, to, quote, mind her place, even in a movement of people of color, is something that moves me more than I can truly even express. And I grew up, my mom used to, I think a lot of Black mothers quote Fannie Lou Hamer when they say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And that's energy, this understanding of perpetual cycles of violence, be it structural or interpersonal and direct or cultural, being so exhaustive. But also, even how I just spoke right now, my language is seeped in the education that I've received, the privilege that I've purchased through education. Mm-hmm. And in reality, I believe Fannie Lou Hamer was impactful because she was true to her rawest voice. And the fact that she lives on in the voices of so many Black femmes even today, and most of them don't know where that quote comes from, speaks to me about what real change has to look like. It has to be clear, it has to be simple, and it has to involve everyone. And I can't say that I disagree with her critique of what felt like an inaccessible civil rights movement for those who were not urban and those who were not educated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's just continued to deepen as like the difference between rich and poor is just widened so much. Yeah.
It can be so destructive in organizing communities. And I think that is what, when I was like reading, I read this great article on the rhetoric of Fannie Lou Hamer, and I'm reading it and I'm just sitting here and I'm like, yeah, we do that. Adrienne Marie Brown does a great job of challenging us to not critique movements because they're not fully formed in this way that we think that they should be fully formed, to not dismiss the beauty of messiness, to not dismiss the importance of organic formation. And I think we often do that. I catch myself doing that. I remember I definitely did that with the early iteration of Black Lives Matter. It's like, where's the leadership? Where's the mandate? Where's the, like, why aren't you guys organized into, like, marching band triangles as you walk down the streets? Like, just like all of this unnecessary critique instead of sitting there and be like, how do I serve? If I am able to see this, then how do I contribute? And so I think deeply about how even in this moment, it is so unacceptable for us to allow what I think is hard for many of us to see in organizing spaces, the way our own class shows up, because we do deeply align ourselves in affinity with those who are most marginalized, even though we might be marginalized ourselves, but at the same time, we're allowing the indoctrination of a certain kind of aesthetic that is tied to class to inform how we show up in movement spaces, who we decide speaks and who we decide doesn't, who we put a megaphone in front of, who we don't, how we use bodies of color in protest versus how do we use those that are white allies in protest. All of those things are on my brain. I think that learning from what was done to Fannie Lou Hamer, not only in her time and place in history, but also the fact that she's been erased, is very, very important. Fannie Lou Hamer was a political operative just like Rosa Parks. So this privying of movement history, I think, has to be disrupted. And I hope to do that by illuminating the legacies of Black femmes, especially those who worked here in the South outside of the history books, and having this farm be a place where people can learn that and learn from it, because there's so much to learn. I cannot quote one thing Coretta Scott King has said. I can't. I can't quote her. But I heard, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired my whole entire life. There's a reason for that. I can't give you one quote from Rosa Parks. And so really being critical about how this movement history has been given to us is important to me.
Well, we love to boil it down to those singular characters and singular moments. And
put narratives in people's mouths, like Rosa Parks. You know, I feel like Todd said she was tired. And it's like, no, Rosa Parks was a highly trained political operative. Like, this was a planned, organized mission. And like all of those moments in history where people have been just like kind of washed away to the symbol that they are, instead of the deep exploration. I want to teach young Girl Scouts that Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer operated like Princess Leia. Like, I want them to understand that these femmes were generals. They were generals. She wasn't a tired seamstress. Like, and that's important because there's so much learning about how do we now show up for each other here. Yes. That I don't have to look at an organizer at a protest and be like, that's not, I do it differently. But instead be like, how can I serve? How can I contribute? What is the cooperative exploration of my role and your role? And how do I find peace and solace in mine?
Right. It like calls that out in you. Calls it out in me. Yes. Yeah. I feel like it's not a coincidence too that so many, I'm glad you're speaking, embodying, but also uplifting all these Black femmes, because like, I feel like those people have held this space in our culture from the beginning of time because they are the nurturers, because they are the creators of life, and because they're the ones on the ground nursing one another. And I think that shift is happening collectively now, but it's just like those are the wisdom streams of like people that know how to keep people alive and thriving and communities connected. Like it's unconscionable that we haven't recognized that on a massive scale.
Yeah, and I think even when it's recognized, it's often relegated to a mammy role. And I mean, I am deeply disappointed in my community. I actually very aggressively put my first like Instagram live video on today, saying like, I'm holding friendships hostage. Like you can't know me if you feel like my job and my role and my knowledge production should be relegated to a place of only nursing you in this moment of crisis. So I think even when people do acknowledge that there is knowledge production, there's sweat equity that's being done in a certain space, I don't think people are being taught about how do you properly use that. And I'm very grateful that I learned from some of my elders in the Bay Area about what it meant to serve. And I was young enough and they were already well elders in their own right and community, that they made it very clear to me what my role was. And I needed that. Yeah. I needed that because I needed someone to show me, how do you walk up with a servant leader energy? Oof. Like, and that has to be taught. Because if not, then I'm draining the people that I revere. I'm misusing the people that I revere. That what I think is love and admiration that I'm pouring on top of them does not feel like reverence. Instead, it feels like a continued cycle of mammification. And so I think teaching, as people are realizing this, I am realizing I have to be more vocal about making it very clear. How do you use this? When you might recognize that there's knowledge production here and sweat equity. How do you actually show up to it? What is the way to show up?
How do you show up to it? I'm recognizing that I have things to learn here. Yeah, like what is the best way to carry that?
I think something that one of my friends said to me recently, said that it is his job to follow my lead. When it comes to how he serves me as a friend. And so this wasn't a movement conversation, but I really liked the framing that it's my job to follow your lead. And it's not because like we're dealing with something that I might be a topic expert in, but it's because that means if I have something to give you that day, the reason you even want to ask of anything from me is because you know I'm going to pass it to you. So don't come to me with the ask, because the reason you're coming to my door in the first place is because you know you will be fed here. So it is your job to then come up and follow my lead. Now, I might ask you to do 4 chores in my house before dinner is served, but if you are coming to my door, it's because you know eventually dinner will be served. So I think as people are approaching their friends and families in this moment, it's so important that they follow their lead. And another thing that's like outside of the following the lead, and this is just another thing that I'm on my soapbox about recently, is understanding that relational culture is not performative. Like, I received a phone call from a friend. It lasted 4 minutes, and it was supposed to be a check-in about how I was doing in this crisis. Do not call someone who you know is doing the work and not actually be able to nourish them if that is what you're saying your intention is. If you're not carving out 2 hours of your time, like this person went to watch a movie with their partner. I'm like, okay, I gotta go watch a movie with my partner. And I was just like, why did you open this door and not actually be able to receive me fully as I am, especially because you said that you were coming up to nourish me. So I think that it's like important for people to really think deeply about how they show up relationally, and are they behaving in a way that actually is going to meet the outcome that they want? If you actually want me to think or know that you are supportive, then creating that in your actions is the first step. Carve out 2 hours of your day. Now, I might say I'm fine and the call lasts 4 minutes, but it should last 4 minutes because I say that that's all I need, not because that's all you had to give.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Okay, last piece. I would love to hear about how plants have helped you in your life.
Plant medicine is so important to my healing. So I think that the first time, I don't know what aspects of plant medicine I would want to start with, but I guess I have like different trajectories, but I'll focus on the first time I ever experienced mushrooms. I was on a birthday trip with my sister friend who at a period of time, she liked to have this annual birthday trip in Joshua Tree National Park. Beautiful, like a great place to experience mushrooms for the first time, I was told. And, I was definitely in a place where I was really reckoning with a lot of my own healing, but also the shift I felt in myself as a femme of color who was navigating multiple identities and prioritizing them based on the spaces I was in. So I consider myself a professional code switcher. Like I can it's so natural to me as a lingering harm of what I had to grow up around. So as much as it is a talent that has taken me places, it is 100% the byproduct of having to survive places where I was not acceptable as I am. And I was moving from London. Again, I went back to grad school in England, and I was moving back to America, and I was really grappling with this. And I remember we took a walk in the woods after we consumed our medicine, and I ended up stumbling upon... This is when this was like before, because you're always like, I don't feel anything until like, and then you feel something, and you're like, oh, I'm here, I've arrived. I stumbled upon a dead cactus, and I just lost myself in this dead cactus. And all I could hear in my head was, Jazz, even the plants and animals that are most adapted for their environment still die. And that was it. That was all I heard, was just that. And when I processed it afterwards, as I was like moving out and transitioning back with the group, before we all, went on with our evening after spending a day hiking, I was like, well, why? Like, why did this come up? Why did this need to be named? Why did my self-conscious need to name this for me? Why was this dead cactus jarring enough for me to stop? I realized that what I was trying to say to myself is that I needed to stop trying to adapt for every different environment I was going into, even within my one day. From ordering at a restaurant and switching my voice, to switching my voice when I'm talking to my mom on the phone, to switching, that I have to find what me is and just stay steady in that, because even the animals that are most adapted, the plants that are most adapted for their environment still die. So what's the point of me trying to be a chameleon? I'm losing energy. I'm losing life as I shift and morph for people and morph for environments. That it doesn't matter, because even if I was a cactus for that environment, even if I was perfectly adapted for that space, the outcome is still the same. So I might as well be me. If I'm going to go out, I might as well be me. And after that, I just had a deep understanding of what is possible, one, internally when you're allowed to listen, and then also what plant medicine can do to amplify your own voice. I think so many of us have learned to shut ourselves out, to learn to not listen deeply, and that was the first opportunity that I heard myself say something that I needed to say in here. Because just like in a restorative justice process, I can't give it to somebody else unless they tell me their story. So I had to listen to my own story so I could figure out how to meet this need that I didn't even know I had. Upon reflection, I definitely saw the evidence, but I didn't know that I had. So as over the past, this was maybe 7 years ago. Is that true? Yeah, 6 years ago? 6 years ago, in that time, I've been introduced to unbelievable scholars, lawyers, scientists, activists that rally around plant medicine as a healing mechanism, especially for those of us who have experienced unbelievable trauma, as a way to not only communicate but let go and address things that we are holding that we won't allow ourselves to see. And I'm just here for it as a beneficiary of that moment and other moments to come. I am here to continue to support, and hopefully as regulations change around this country, be able to hold large, open, intentional, relational spaces for people to come and receive the healing that I was so privileged to receive from myself. And that's what I think. It's just the plant was just like AT&T. They just needed to connect me to me. They just operated like the phone line, because in reality, the healing is you. We know what is needed to say, even if we have a guide. The guide is helping us just translate to ourselves what we're putting out there. And I just want that. I want everybody to be able to have that access.
Yes. Yes, I resonate so much with that. And also the communal aspect that you're speaking about. I see that so much in these indigenous lineages that we've lost or destroyed, that these are communal modalities for problem solving and healing. And it's thank you. Yes.
Yeah, and I think the only the opposition to it is often because people are looking at examples of people doing it in a space that is antithetical to the way the plant is to be consumed and used. So, yeah, if you're thinking about like a college student who has a bad trip, gets naked and busts some car windows because you saw it on the nightly news, yes, you could blame the plant, or you can blame the lack of relational culture. Where was this young person's community? Where was this young person's guide? Who is this person's people? Who are they? And the reality is, if you break down and ask those questions, which if I handled that case in a restorative justice way, that would be something we'd work out, because that person's needs weren't met. Their relational needs weren't met. They were harmed by whoever decided that they were okay to be by themselves or to be so disconnected from community that this is where they went, or being so disconnected from the intention that is needed when engaging with medicine, which is why it's so important to call it plant medicine, is the intention. Then that moment is clearly not about the plant and is 100% about the relations that young person or that older person or whoever it is was engaging with that were not nourishing to them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. Does that mean that when you're working with plants now, you tend towards like a strong ceremonial or ritual container for it?
For myself. I think that I try to curate that piece for myself because, again, I think that there are still spaces that miss that intent. So I might walk into a space where supposedly that's the intention. I look around and I'm like, clearly that's not the intention. So I have to make this for myself because for me, I'm going to honor the purpose and I'm going to make sure that that's what my experience looks and feels like, which is why I feel like I've never had a negative experiences, because I've always tried to bring that. And I'm very lucky to my sister who first introduced me to plant medicine, because that is what she fostered. And she chose to be the nurturing individual in that space that made sure we were all taken care of. So I was introduced to this in that way, and I continue to honor it in that way, even if I'm in spaces that I feel like aren't doing that to the fullest.
And I know that the psychedelic community, if there is such a thing as a monolith, like it has a diversity problem, it has an access problem, and I feel really committed to like that is an imperative of like being in relationship with plants and like listening to the call of psychedelics, is like the community has to reflect that. So I really appreciate that you're making access so much a part of your mission. Yeah,
the medicine itself grew in a community, so why on earth would we consume it as individuals?
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense to me. Yeah. If we're going to connect with that earth, then like it needs to be, we need to return to who we are supposed to be as pack animals, which means we're relational, which means we're intentional and we're taking care of each other.
Thank you. I so appreciate your time. You're a beautiful speaker. I feel like my energy is through the roof. I'm just like ready to go out there and do things today. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to me.
Yeah. Is there anything to close that we haven't touched on that you'd like to share?
If anyone who is listening is interested in any of this work, start a book club. Oof. I think that restorative justice, transformative justice, even plant medicine, criminal justice reform, all of those things feel far away. But in reality, it only takes 3 intentional people and 1 good book to start a ripple effect that could change structures. And I have been in England, there's a fully restorative city called Hull. And Hull,
really?
Yeah, they that's what they pride themselves on, of being the first like fully restorative city in the UK. And the thing that I love about Hull is Hull's story. Hull's story started with an elementary teacher who had read something about restorative justice, and through the transformation of herself as an individual, she was able to change other teachers, then the admin, and then other schools. And then when people saw schools were doing this, they were like, we want this, and we want this with our police. And when the police were doing it, I think the most funny and outrageous example of restorative justice in Hull was that the local soccer team was also then engaged with restorative practices. So I think that for people who feel like they have to be someone that they are not, they are wrong. If one elementary school teacher could change a whole city for forever, any of us can do it if our heart and intention is in it.
Are there any books that you'd recommend people read?
That's hard.
Putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I think it's hard because I'm so much in I feel like I'm battling with my RJ houses right now. Like, which house do I tap into? But I will say, if people are looking for resources, Living Justice Press is a wonderful press house that publishes a lot of my community's work around restorative justice. And there is a book that is coming out called Colorizing Restorative Justice, and it's edited by one of my elders, Edward Valandra, and it is a beautiful look at restorative justice through the lens of practitioners of color who often haven't had their stories told, because just like the plant medicine community in America that is tapped into an indigenous practice and practicing in a contemporary time, restorative justice is also tapping into indigenous practices in a contemporary time, and they are both in the same journey of kind of reckoning with the lack of diversity, the lack of honoring, and the kind of capitalist-like consumption of thought production and sweat equity from communities of color. So this book is the beginning of that reckoning. So I definitely would highly recommend that book.
Thank you. And where can people find you and find the farm and support the work you're doing?
If you would like to get in contact with me about something more serious than what Instagram can hold, my website is www.jasmyn, Jasmyn, story.com. And my Instagram is @storyismyname. So hopefully that's easy to remember. And from there, you can find the People's Coalition, which is my nonprofit, as well as Freedom Farm Missoula.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was awesome.
I feel you all out there listening and fighting and growing, making yourselves uncomfortable. It's beautiful. It's necessary. I'm so glad that you're showing up. Please don't stop. To my fellow white people, please take what you're learning right now and use it to transform your communities and your families. Don't let this be a moment or a fad, but let this be the beginning of new practices, new ways of being. I want to leave us with James Baldwin, who should be taught in every school. He is the most beautiful teacher. I'm sure many of you know. If you haven't, please go watch I Am Not Your Negro. There's plenty of clips of him speaking on YouTube. He is the most beautiful and potent writer on race and humanity and what it means to be an artist in a time of oppression and turmoil. This is a short clip from that documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, from the 1960s. On the future of America. I love you all so much, and I feel you out there. Thank you.
I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means that you have agreed that human life is an academic matter. So I'm forced to be an optimist. I'm forced to believe that we can survive whatever we must survive. But the Negro in this country, the future of the Negro in this country is precisely as bright or as dark as the future of the country. It is entirely up to the American people and our representatives. It is entirely up to the American people whether or not they're going to face and deal with and embrace this stranger whom they maligned so long. What white people have to do is try to find out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. Because I'm not a nigger. I'm a man. But if you think I'm a nigger, it means you need it. The question you've got to ask yourself, the white population of this country has got to ask itself, North and South, because it's one country, and for a Negro, there is no difference in the North and the South. There's just a difference in the way they castrate you. But the fact of the castration is the American fact. If I'm not the nigger here, and you invented him, you, the white people, invented him, then you got to find out why. And the future of the country depends on that, whether or not it's able to ask that question.